But for the most part, we are a country that was born like every other country. Every continent had slaves. In the South, most houses, most plantations had slaves. Nobody condones it. But without those slave owners, we don't have a country. So you make your choice. I mean, if you don't like our country, travel. And if you find a place better, stay. And stop messing with our past, So we create our own events. And in the beginning, I thought it was just going to be great just to be an opportunity to sell books. Now it's like a mission on a war to win the war on history. Because the 1619 Project was the formal first salvo. But it's been happening for quite a long time. I mean, I'm older than you, and in 1976, I was in grade school, and they launched this thing called Roots, the most successful miniseries ever, averaged 60 million a night. It was the story of slavery in all its brutality. Nobody was ever ducking our past. I don't know what people are talking about. And no one ever said, oh, segregation, not that bad. Slavery, well, it happens. Nobody, Republican or Democrat, especially because most of these people were Democrats. They kept on pushing to keep it and tried to almost reinstall it in the 20th century. Having said that, we've come a long way.
This story right here was posted into my Discord and it was attached with an article, but I think I can honestly handle this commentary without having to attach my reading of the article to it because it's pretty self-explanatory. So in this picture, you see a man by the name of Brian Kilmeade. I believe he's some kind of person that was, again, one of these failed politicians or politicians or whoever was running for something, and then now they gotta shift and hang on to whatever it is that they're doing right now, as you can clearly hear in this video. But I believe he was always that way. But one thing, before I actually get into what he said, two things are not beyond my scope when I looked at this image that you see on your screen right now. Two things. One, he happens to be talking about slave owners, and he has a picture of one of the biggest slave owners behind him, being George Washington. That's the first thing I noticed. The second thing I noticed is I looked at the bottom right corner and saw that logo right there to show you whose show he's on when he spewed this rhetoric, and that is none other than Charlie Kirk. Now, y'all know I have talked about Charlie Kirk on my channel a numerous amount of times, especially more so this year than anything, especially when he was going off about Juneteenth back in June. And I'm not going to rehash that. If you want to know what I had to say about Charlie Kirk about that, y'all can go and check that out. That's that video I did about him, Candace Owens, and Vivek Ramaswamy. But that is in my scope as well, that he's on Charlie Kirk's show, and you can hear Charlie Kirk laughing there in the background as Brian Kilmeade is sitting up there just straight up lying about what he is talking about. So he's sitting up here on Charlie Kirk's show, a person who shouldn't have one, but he's sitting up there talking about how this country would not be what it is if it wasn't for slave owners. And I'm sitting here saying to myself, it doesn't surprise me that he's sitting up there and he's bigging up his ancestors. Yes, it's not surprising to me that he's sitting up there big upping his ancestors and the savagery that they committed against our ancestors, my ancestors, way back when, all those hundreds of years ago, and for hundreds of years indeed. And how they were able to basically get and shoehorn their way into this economy and jumpstart and kickstart their way up, as well as their descendants going forward after they passed on. Just keep in mind, he said that if it wasn't for the slave owners, he didn't say if it wasn't for the slaves. Well, here's the thing, Brian, if it wasn't for the slaves that your ancestors had enslaved, what would they be owners of? What would their purpose actually be? Like, seriously, what would their purpose actually be? And you know what? I've always told people on my channel before, and I'm sure you've heard it from other people. Some of you have actually said it. These are the type of dub S's that we like. The ones who say it out loud, they have no filter, they say exactly how they feel about themselves, about how they feel about us especially, and they don't try to hide it behind some kind of a guise or whatever the case may be. He said the quiet part out loud just now, and he said it very unapologetically. He didn't mince his words. He didn't hold back. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said. And I'm glad that this is all very documented right here. The only reason y'all couldn't see the video itself and only could hear the audio is because of copyright purposes, so I had to put the picture over it. But that is him speaking right there on Charlie Kirk's show, saying that slave owners built America. Keep in mind, the slave owners, when chattel slavery was officially abolished, it was officially done, the slave owners got reparations. They got paid for loss of labor, loss of property, and loss of labor. They got paid a lot of money, or what could have been considered a lot of money back then, which of course adjusted for inflation today is millions and millions of dollars. I wouldn't be surprised if it's near $1 billion, to be quite honest with you. He made sure to establish and tell people that it was his ancestors that built America, not the people that his ancestors enslaved that did all the work on the plantations. All his ancestors did was oversee on those horses with the whip. And when they weren't overseeing, they were violating the women and buck breaking the men, and as well as violating the children as well, and violating their own women. If we're just talking about the men, the women, they engaged in it too, like quiet as it is kept. They don't call them the daughters of the Confederacy for nothing. And then he went on. You know, it looked like it was kind of edited because it jumped from one clip to the next, and then he started talking about roots. And you know, he briefly talked about roots, and it's almost like he tried to downplay that part of roots and all of that stuff. And then he went into this little small tangent towards the end, talking about this is his quote unquote war on history. This sounds to me like he wanted to say war on wokeness. You know, they love to talk about the war on woke, or this is woke, or that is woke, and I'm anti-woke, and I'm anti-woke this and that. You know, they love to use that. But he said this is his war on history. I keep telling y'all, true history is completely lost on them. I just did a video where I talked about briefly and highlighted something called the post-truth era. Again, shout out to Rob over at Blacklight Revelations. He's the one that put me on game when it came to looking up or researching what the post-truth era is. Brian Kilmeade is a perfect example based on what he said in this almost 1.5 minute audio that you heard, that he benefits from the post-truth era. He has no problem pushing that, and then they will take whatever they say in the post-truth era and then remix it and rebox it and repackage it and say this is the truth. This is the truth that I want you to know, and this is going to be the truth that you're going to lean on, not deviate from. Why? Because I'm white and I say so. God damn it. And there's plenty of people out there that will agree and hang off of every word that Brian Kilmeade said, but there are actually just as many more people who thinks this guy is a straight up idiotic, ignorant dub S. I've read the comments, like someone, whoever posted, I forgot who posted it in my Discord. It was on Raw Story. That comment section, if I'm not mistaken, had like 336 comments, and just about every last one of them, with the exception of a few, had nothing but very disparaging things to say about what Brian Kilmeade said in that clip. And it was a mixed bag of people, us, PC, and probably some other people, but I saw those two in particular, like literally saying that, you know, he's probably saying, for some, this is shock value. This is not shocking coming from him. Like, them saying stuff like this is no longer shocking nor surprising to us. It's just that we are glad that you're actually saying it, and we don't have to guess or assume. Thank you for allowing us to show, thank you for showing us your true colors. Thank you for showing us the other side of your two faces. Thank you. We actually applaud you for doing this. Now that means we know how to deal with you accordingly. Again, he said that the slave owners built America. So basically, if the slave owners built America, then what did the slaves do? Because for 400 plus years, my ancestors were definitely not just sitting on their hands all day and not doing anything. That could possibly be said about you. And one thing a lot of people don't tell you when it comes to chattel slavery is that even if there was some PC people back then who didn't own slaves because they probably couldn't afford to, because you had to have money to own slaves back then. You couldn't be poor. Even if you didn't, they sometimes worked with actual slave owners and possibly had maybe some of their slaves come and do some work for them, but they did not own them. So the poor PC even back then still benefited from chattel slavery, even though they couldn't engage in the economy part of owning a slave. So they basically, I guess you can say, they borrowed a slave or two or a dozen if they needed some work done, but they had to hand them back over. It's basically the equivalent if you don't have any children, but you have nieces and nephews that you babysit for a couple of hours because maybe your sibling and your in-law maybe went on a date and they needed someone to watch the kids. They only with you for a couple of hours, but guess what? When that date is over and they come and pick them up, you send them right back to their parents. That is basically the equivalent of a poor PC individual back then who could not afford a slave, but they still benefited off of the economy in some way if they needed some work done. If they were good with that slave owner, if they were good friends with them, they'll send a couple their way as long as they were sent back by a certain time. They couldn't stay over. They just was there for a little, for the day, and they sent them right back. So that's another thing that they don't really tell you about that as well, because a lot of people say not all PC people own slaves. That may be true, and that's a huge maybe, but there were those who didn't own who definitely borrowed. Let's be completely clear and honest with ourselves here, because that's another way that they'll say, oh, we didn't need our ancestors, we didn't need slaves and everything like that. But like I said, you may not have owned a slave, but you probably borrowed one from a slave owner if you needed something done. And a lot of the times they were able-bodied to do it themselves, but like I said, they weren't going to do it. They weren't about to get their hands dirty. But let Brian Kilmeade say it. His ancestors, the slave owners, or as Bravo or Black Light Revelations call them, the Adoso, the American descendant of slave owners, because that's what Brian is. They built this establishment. They built America. Let him tell it. And I'm willing to bet if Brian Kilmeade has any kids, he probably tells his children that. And probably told them at a very young age. And not just Brian Kilmeade, but there's probably other PC people who spread that same propaganda to their kids. That's how you keep the cycle going. People say, oh, the old folks are gonna die out, bigotry and dub-s is gonna die out with them. No, it's not. No, it is not. Keep in mind, how old was Dylan Roof when he did what he did? How old was Peyton Gendron when he did what he did? How old was Ryan Palmer when he did what he did? They were all born in the 2000s. Well, with the exception of Dylan Roof. Dylan Roof might have been born in the late 90s, but that, again, he's still part of Gen Z. All the other ones were born in the 2000s. So when people try to say, oh, it is dying out with their grandparents, it's funny how they started off saying it died out with their great-grandparents. Then they said, no, it's going to die out with the grandparents. Then they say it's going to die out with their parents. It seems to me like the generations are getting closer and closer and closer to recent. So after the parents is the kids. So when they try to sit up there and tell you, oh, it's going to end with them or their parents or their grandparents or whatever the case may be, they are lying. That cycle is still ongoing to this day, even with the younger generation of today, those who are younger than me. Remember, I'm a millennial. The Gen Z line, I believe, starts in 96 or 7. I can't remember the exact years, but it's one of those 2 years. Keep in mind that a lot of these people who go in there and harm black people in mass, like what Ryan Palmer did and what Peyton Gendry did, they were 18, 19, some 17, some as young as 15, which means they were all born in the early 2000s. Just keep that in mind. Some of their parents, depending on when they conceived, were probably born in the early 80s, which means they are Gen X. And if they were born in 82, they just made the millennial line. So I don't want to hear them say, oh, it's going out with them, it's dying off with them. It's not. It's really not. It's an ongoing cycle. It's passed down like a family heirloom.